Any right that has been claimed but that the government has not already honored or granted is an indication that the right must come from beyond the government. If we say the government should grant such a right, we must appeal to something beyond the government, a transcendent standard by which we can ground that claim and from which that right must come. Hey guys, I'm Bill Westers, and this is the Encountering Truth podcast. Welcome to the Encountering Truth podcast, where we examine the evidence for Christianity, engage culture with kindness and conviction, and encounter Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. The Declaration of Independence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Every year around this time, we celebrate the birth of our nation on the 4th of July, 1776, Independence Day. Everywhere you go, you see fireworks, American flags, expressions of patriotism, and a general appreciation for our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness here in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And as we celebrate our Declaration of Independence and the birth of the United States of America, I think there's something very significant that many people miss in all of it. And I'm not talking about the patriotism or the founding of the United States. I'm not even talking about specifically about the founding fathers or the idea that the country was built on Christian principles. But I am talking about something in particular that the founding fathers got right. I'm talking today about this idea of what we call human rights. You see, people talk about human rights all the time, but how often do we truly think about what they actually are or where they come from? Well, first of all, let's look at what is a right. If you Google the definition of a right, it says something to which one has a just claim. Another definition says a moral or legal entitlement to have or obtain something or to act in a certain way. So notice the language here. What makes a claim, quote unquote, just? And what makes an entitlement moral or legal? Rights must be grounded in a standard, a just or moral or legal standard. We don't often think about this, but there are different kinds of rights. Different types of rights are grounded in different types of standards. Obviously, a legal standard for an entitlement is that which is grounded in the law. And certain laws grant or limit certain rights. And of course, it is the legislating body of the government that creates or changes these laws. So think of the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, right? Appropriately named. The Bill of Rights offers us things like the right to peaceably assemble, the right to bear arms, the right to a fair trial, and so on. Among many other things, but not every country has a Bill of Rights like ours, right? And if the legislative body of the government can change laws and make new laws, then they can change the laws that give us these rights. In other words, if the government is who gives you the rights, then the government can also take away those rights simply by changing the law. For example, in 1919, the 18th Amendment imposed a nationwide prohibition on alcohol. Legislation was passed that revoked citizens' rights to manufacture, sell, and transport alcoholic beverages. Of course, that amendment was repealed later by the 21st Amendment in 1933, and those rights were given back to the people. And so, certainly, some rights are legal entitlements granted by the government, which of course means they can be taken away by the government, such as the right to bear arms, the right to a fair trial, the right to vote at a particular age. But these are not what we would call universal rights, as they can change by modifying the legal standard, and legal entitlements can vary depending on the different governing bodies, whether that's from the state to state or from country to country. So what makes something a universal right? First, by being called a universal right, that would mean that it would have to apply to everyone, everywhere. And so what would give someone, as the definition said, a just claim or a moral entitlement to something? The right would have to be grounded in a just or moral standard. And in order for a right to be universal, it must be grounded in a universal standard that applies to everyone, everywhere. Well, on December 10th, 1948, the United Nations released the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. According to the UN's website, this document sets out for the first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected. Many of the rights in this declaration are similar to what we would find in the United States Constitution or Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence. And among these rights, determined by the United Nations to be universal, are things like the right to life, liberty, and what they call the security of person. They said no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. They offer the right to a fair and public hearing by an independent, impartial tribunal. The right to freedom of peaceful assembly. So very, very similar to what we see in our founding documents. And so what makes these rights universal then? Well, simply the fact that the United Nations says that they are. Don't they depend more on the laws of the individual country? Clearly, some of these rights are not granted within certain member nations of the United Nations. For example, Article 9 says that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Is that universal around the world? Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Well, here's looking at you, North Korea, right? Okay. And then Article 18 says that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Well, think about a place like Iran or Saudi Arabia, where a conversion from Islam to Christianity or any other religion can have significant ramifications, punishment, even by death. And so clearly, as we said, these rights are not universally accepted, even by some of the member nations of the United Nations. So we can see that these universal rights depend more on the laws of the individual countries. And not to mention, if they were, quote unquote, drafted by the UN in 1948, well, couldn't they theoretically be modified or even rejected outright at some point? Also, if these are the universal rights, were they not universal before the UN declared it so? And what if the UN is dissolved at some point in the future? Will they no longer be rights? Well, if you read through the document of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you can clearly see that many of the ideas, they're solid, and I'm not disagreeing with these rights in any way. In fact, in the preamble to this declaration. They say the dignity and worth of the human person and the equal rights of men and women. They mention these things. And in Article 1, it says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So they use this language like faith in fundamental human rights, endowed with reason and conscience, and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. However, unlike the Declaration of Independence, which identifies the source of human rights as being endowed by our Creator, when you look closely at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you can find nothing by which to ground these rights other than because we all voted on it and decided that's how it should be. So, sure, they point to the idea of human dignity, which I won't argue is certainly universal, but not because the UN says it is. They have to ground even that somewhere, somehow. And it can't just be a because we say so type of thing. That would just be based on personal preference, albeit widely accepted by many nations and in cultures throughout the world. It would still be just basic personal preference within society. So human rights are most definitely linked to that idea that we mentioned of human dignity and worth. But that is only because of the Christian doctrine that says that all humans have inherent dignity and worth because they are created in the image of God, according to Genesis chapter 1. Now, Tom Holland, the historian, not the Spider-Man actor, he wrote a book called Dominion: How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And Holland, now, he's not a Christian, but he says that for most of history, the idea that humans have self-evident rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness would have been baffling. A Roman would have laughed at it. In one interview, he says that the West has, quote, been in a position to assume that its concept of human rights is somehow universal. They don't need to think about it. Of course human rights exist. But what the rise of China and other civilizational powers is doing is to remind us that the concept of human rights is one that has emerged in a very specific cultural matrix, which is a Christian one. And therefore, if you want to believe in human rights, he says, you have to believe. It takes a leap of faith to believe that there are things called human rights, just as much as it takes a leap of faith to believe the Lord Jesus Christ raised from the dead. They're both beliefs, end quote. Now, I would differ, of course, with Holland on the idea that it takes a leap of faith to believe in human rights or in the resurrection of Jesus. Since we've talked about before on here, is that there's actually a great deal of evidence that suggests that the resurrection actually occurred, to the point where it is in fact the most reasonable explanation from the evidence that we have. However, I do agree with him that human rights are rooted in the theological belief that humans have inherent dignity endowed by their Creator, God, who made them in His image and likeness. What many people don't understand is that if there is no God, there are no human rights. Dr. Carl Trueman, in his landmark work, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, details the rise of what he calls expressive individualism. This idea that, quote, each of us finds our meaning by giving expression to our own feelings and desires, end quote. In the book, he explains, quote, one of the aspects of the modern culture of expressive individualism is the emphasis it places on the inherent dignity of the individual. The idea that all human beings are of equal worth is rooted in the idea that all human beings are made in the image of God. The problem with expressive individualism is not its emphasis on the dignity or the individual value of every human being. That is what undergirded the fight against slavery in the 19th century and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Rather, it is the fact that expressive individualism has detached these concepts of individual dignity and value from any kind of grounding in a sacred order. Truman argues that, quote, the untethering of what it means to be human from any kind of metaphysical framework has rendered the notion of universal individual dignity something that threatens to push the West into a kind of totalitarian anarchy, to use an oxymoron, end quote. This is exactly what the Human Rights Campaign is actually doing. Now, on their front homepage, they say that the Human Rights Campaign envisions a world where every member of the LGBTQ plus family has the freedom to live their truth without fear and with equality under the law, end quote. One of their values is respect. And on that page, they explain this. They say, quote, we root ourselves in our shared humanity and treat each other with kindness and compassion. We're at our best when we honor the equal dignity and worth of all people, even in the face of conflict, end quote. The Human Rights Campaign has, as Truman put it, detached these concepts of individual dignity and value from any kind of grounding in a sacred order. Again, universal rights have to be grounded in something universal, something transcendent, something above and beyond the government, and even above and beyond the United Nations. See, and moral entitlements, as the definition goes, must be grounded in a transcendent moral standard. And what could serve as the transcendent moral standard above governments and all of humanity? What kind of standard could have that kind of authority other than the perfect moral standard that is God's very nature? Frank Turek, in his book, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case, argues that, quote, atheists have long been critical of Christians for trying to legislate morality, but atheists are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to legislate their new absolutes over the old self-evident ones grounded in God. For example, many atheists are ardent supporters of absolute rights to abortion, same-sex marriage, taxpayer-provided health care, welfare, contraceptives, and several other entitlements. But who says those are rights? By what objective standard are abortion, same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption, taxpayer-provided health care, and the like moral rights? There isn't such a standard in an atheistic universe. So atheists must steal the grounds for objective moral rights from God while arguing that God doesn't exist. End quote. So like we said, there are some rights from the government, like the right to bear arms, the right to vote, and so on. But universal rights don't come from the government. If they did, then the government could just take them away, and thus they would not be universal rights, right? So, in fact, the Declaration of Independence makes this very clear. It says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Okay? Governments are instituted to secure the rights, not to offer the rights, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government. So if the people have the right to alter or abolish the government for not securing the rights that they have, then those rights certainly cannot come from the government. They must appeal to something beyond the government to be able to abolish or alter the government that's not securing their rights. So often, the very reason that someone declares that they have a right to something is precisely because that right is not actually being offered. Any right that has been claimed but that the government has not already honored or granted is an indication that the right must come from beyond the government. If we say the government should grant us such a right, we must appeal to something beyond the government, a transcendent standard by which we can ground that claim and from which that right must come. Why should the government grant that right? If rights come from the government, whether that's local or federal or even global, then if the government doesn't grant you that right, then you simply just don't have it, and nor do you have any basis for demanding it. If rights come from the government, it makes no sense to say that you have a right to something that the government hasn't given you. But think about what this means for history. Any right that the government hadn't granted people just wasn't a right, and they had no basis to demand it. For instance, think about slavery and the abolitionist movement. Think about the civil rights movement, equal rights for women, even the right to life. If rights don't come from beyond the government, then these things could not have happened, or at least they could not have been called good or moral. In fact, it could not have been even called a civil rights movement. If the government is the ultimate authority for what is good and moral, it would by definition be immoral to make a claim against the government in pursuit of any rights that the government hadn't already offered. If society and the government are who determine our rights, what is a just claim, our moral entitlements, then there can be no social reform. There can only be social change. It wouldn't be for the better or for the worse. It would just be different. And there would therefore be nothing that anyone could even say about it. So if you say that you have a right to something that the government does not currently grant you, you must appeal to something beyond the government from which that right must come. Therefore, the source of the right now becomes important. Because if the source says you ought not have that right, there is nothing greater to appeal to. For example, if the source is the God of Christianity, then God's standard of morality is now going to come into play as the determining factor for what would be granted as a right. In which case, such things as abortion and same-sex marriage that violate that standard could in no way actually even be considered a right. So the source would also then be the arbiter. If a so-called right violates the moral standard of the source, or if according to the source a particular right does or ought not exist, then such is the case, and it makes no sense to declare or demand otherwise. So the Human Rights Campaign, since its very claims violate the moral standard of God as the source of human equity, dignity, and worth, it makes arbitrary and meaningless claims to many of the so-called rights for the LGBTQ community. And so going back to Frank Turek's book, Stealing from God, he says, quote, "Without God, there are no objective human rights. There's no right to abortion or same-sex marriage. Of course, without God, there is no right to life or natural marriage either. In other words, no matter what side of the political aisle you're on, no matter how passionate you believe in certain causes or rights, without God, they aren't really rights at all. Human rights amount to no more than subjective preferences. So atheists can believe in and fight for rights to abortion, same-sex marriage, and taxpayer-provided entitlements, but they can't justify them as truly being rights. In fact, to be a consistent atheist, and this is going to sound outrageous, but it's true, you can't believe that anyone has ever actually changed the world for the better. Objectively good political or moral reform is impossible in an atheistic world, which means you have to believe that everything that Wilberforce, Lincoln, and Martin Luther King did to abolish slavery and racism wasn't really good. It was just different. It means you have to believe that rescuing Jews from the ovens was not objectively better than murdering them. It means you have to believe that gay marriage is no better than gay bashing. You may be thinking that's outrageous. Racism, murder, assault, and rape are objectively wrong, and people do have a right to not be harmed. And I agree, he says. But that's true only if God exists. In an atheistic universe, there is nothing objectively wrong with anything at any time. There are no limits. Anything goes, which means to be a consistent atheist, you have to believe in the outrageous. End quote. So, as Chuck Colson once said, if God is thrown out of our history, we lose our basis for believing that individuals have rights and dignity. In an empty universe, we have no meaning, no value. Without God, there are no unalienable rights, and no certain proof that liberty is better than tyranny or that life is better than death. Everything is a matter of opinion and power. Without God, as the source of all those moral principles, the public square would quickly revert to the law of the jungle. Brutish power would prevail. The weak, the unborn, the elderly, and the gravely ill could be quietly terminated. End quote. So, in summary, human rights exist. Not because someone said they do. Not because people voted that they do. They don't come from the government, and they don't come from the United Nations. See, all men are created equal, and we are endowed by our Creator with these unalienable rights. We have human rights because we have been made in the image of God, and that alone gives us inherent dignity and worth. Our rights come from our Creator, and the source matters because the source determines what is actually a right and what might just be a preference. So, of all these rights, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, there is one right that stands above them all. In John chapter 1, verse 12 and 13, it says, "But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." So thank you guys for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure that you take the time and subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a good rating on Spotify. Write us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help to be able to reach more people. And make sure to share it with your friends and on social media, and follow our Facebook page. And of course, visit the website encounteringtruth.org. Remember, let's make it our goal to examine the evidence, engage culture, and encounter Jesus. God bless. We'll see you next time.